Pedro was a boy of just 12 years old, but his life already bore the marks of a difficult journey. Orphaned since the age of 10, after losing his parents in a tragic car accident, he found himself alone in the world, with no family or anyone willing to take him in. With nowhere to go, he ended up living on the streets, facing the cold, hunger, and the indifference of the people around him. During the day, Pedro wandered the sidewalks of the main avenues, gazing at shop windows displaying things he could never have. The smell of food wafting from restaurants made his stomach churn with hunger, but he was already accustomed to scarcity. Sometimes he managed to get a few coins by begging from the more generous passers-by. Other times he rummaged through trash bins in search of leftovers. He slept wherever he could, under awnings, in plazas, or even in dark alleys where danger lurked at every turn. Despite the hardships, Pedro had a special sparkle in his eyes. Deep down, he still carried dreams and hope. He loved soccer, and whenever he saw children playing with a ball in the street, his heart would beat faster. Sometimes he would join in, showing impressive skill. But at the end of the day, the harsh reality always reminded him that his greatest struggle was simply to survive. That night, the cold gripped the city, and Pedro felt his stomach growl with hunger. It had been over a day since his last decent meal, a piece of bread given to him by a kind lady in the plaza. As he walked along the illuminated streets, he watched people entering and leaving restaurants, laughing and enjoying steaming plates of food. The smell of food filled his nostrils, intensifying his pain and longing for just one hot meal. It was then, as he passed by a fancy restaurant, that Pedro mustered the courage to go inside. The place was luxurious, with neatly set tables, soft lighting, and elegantly dressed people. Some customers looked at him with discomfort, bothered by his dirty clothes and face marked by hardship. Pedro approached the counter and with a trembling voice asked the waiter if he could have any leftover food, anything they could spare. Before the waiter could respond, the restaurant manager approached with a look of disdain. He glanced Pedro up and down and without hesitation spoke harshly, "This is no place for beggars. Get out before I call security." The boy felt his face burn with shame. Some customers chuckled softly while others simply looked away, pretending not to notice the scene. Pedro tried to insist, explaining that he didn't want money, just something to eat. But the manager, impatient, roughly pushed him out, causing him to stumble and fall onto the cold sidewalk. The pain of the fall was nothing compared to the humiliation he felt. Tears welled up in his eyes, but he swallowed them, trying to maintain his dignity. He was used to rejection, but that night it felt especially cruel. What he didn't know was that someone had witnessed everything, and his life was about to change forever. Pedro remained seated on the sidewalk for a few moments, feeling the pain of the fall and the humiliation burning in his chest. People continued to walk past him as if he were invisible, ignoring his presence and his suffering. He thought about getting up and leaving, but his legs felt weak, not just from the impact of the fall, but from the hunger consuming him. It was then that a shadow approached him. Pedro felt a presence beside him, and looking up saw a tall, well-dressed man with a serious yet kind expression. The glow of the restaurant lights reflected on his face, and for a moment Pedro thought he was dreaming. But no, he was really there, looking at him with concern. That man was Cristiano Ronaldo. The soccer player had just arrived at the restaurant for dinner after an event and had witnessed the entire scene of Pedro's humiliation. He saw the manager heartlessly expel the boy, noticed the disdainful looks from the customers, and more than anything saw the sadness in the boy's eyes. It deeply troubled him. He knew poverty firsthand. Having come from a humble family in Portugal, he understood what it was like to grow up with hardships. Yet, unlike many, he had been given the opportunity to change his reality. And now, seeing Pedro there, alone and hungry, he felt something inside him say that he needed to do something. Cristiano Ronaldo walked over to the boy and extended his hand to help him up. Pedro, still in disbelief, hesitated for a moment before accepting. Once he was on his feet, Ronaldo placed a hand on his shoulder and asked in a calm voice, "Are you okay, kid?" Pedro, surprised and embarrassed, looked down and simply nodded. He recognized that face. He had seen it on posters, on TV, in sports stores. But he could never have imagined that one of the greatest soccer players in the world would be there, in front of him, asking if he was okay. Without taking his eyes off the boy, Ronaldo turned to the restaurant and called the manager in a firm tone, "I need to speak with you, now." The manager, who had been busy attending to other customers, turned and froze when he realized who was calling him. His face turned pale. He never expected Cristiano Ronaldo, one of the most famous players in the world, to witness his actions, and now demand an explanation. Silence fell over the restaurant and all eyes turned to the unexpected scene. Pedro didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in a long time, he felt that someone truly cared about him, and that was more valuable than any plate of food. The restaurant manager hesitantly walked over to Cristiano Ronaldo, still unable to believe what was happening. His demeanor, which had been full of arrogance when expelling Pedro, now showed nervousness and concern. After all, mistreating a homeless boy was something he did without a second thought, but now, in front of one of the most influential men in the world, his confidence wavered. "Is there a problem, Mr. Ronaldo?" the manager asked, trying to maintain his composure. The soccer player crossed his arms and looked directly into the man's eyes. His voice was calm but carried a firmness. "Yes, there's a big problem. I just saw you humiliate this boy simply because he was hungry. Instead of helping him, you treated him as if he were nothing." The manager swallowed hard and looked around, noticing that all the restaurant's customers were paying attention to the conversation. Some people whispered among themselves, while others looked at Ronaldo with admiration. Feeling the pressure mount, he tried to justify his actions. "Sir, I'm just following the establishment's rules. We have an image to uphold." "And you think expelling a hungry child improves that image?" Ronaldo shot back, raising an eyebrow. "Because outside this restaurant, there's a real world where many people are struggling to survive. And this boy here, he just wanted a plate of food." The silence in the restaurant became almost palpable. Some customers began to look at Pedro with a bit more empathy, while others lowered their heads, ashamed of having laughed at the situation minutes earlier. Cristiano Ronaldo then crouched down to Pedro's level and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Come with me, kid," he said with a gentle smile. Pedro looked at him, confused. Was he hearing correctly? Was this man really inviting him into the restaurant? Before the manager could say anything, Ronaldo walked with Pedro to a table right in the center of the establishment and pulled out a chair for him to sit. Then he called a waiter and said without hesitation, "I want you to bring him the best dish on the menu, the full course with everything he wants." The waiter, surprised, quickly nodded and rushed to the kitchen. The manager, realizing that any attempt to stop the situation would only make things worse for him, decided to remain silent. Pedro, still stunned, looked around, unsure how to react. Never in his life had someone treated him with such respect and dignity. He felt the eyes on him, but this time they weren't filled with disdain. For a moment, it was as if he was no longer invisible to the world. Cristiano Ronaldo sat across from him, resting his arms on the table. "What's your name?" he asked with a friendly smile. Pedro," the boy replied, still hesitant. "Well, Pedro," Ronaldo continued, "I want to hear your story. How did you end up here?" Pedro's heart raced. No one had ever asked about his life, his pain, or who he was. But now, sitting across from one of the greatest soccer players in the world, he felt that, for the first time in a long time, someone truly wanted to listen. And in that restaurant, between a hot meal and a look of compassion, Pedro began to tell his story, unaware that this moment would mark the beginning of a great transformation in his life. Pedro hesitated for a moment, looking down at the table. He wasn't used to talking about himself, especially to someone like Cristiano Ronaldo. But there was something about the way the player looked at him, his sincere gaze, his welcoming demeanor, that made Pedro feel like, for the first time in a long time, he didn't need to be afraid to open up. He began, his voice trembling slightly, "I don't really know where to start." "Start from the beginning," Ronaldo said with an encouraging smile. Pedro took a deep breath and began to tell his story. He talked about his parents, how they were hard-working but had little money. He recounted the accident that took their lives and how, with no relatives willing to take him in, he ended up on the streets. He described the cold nights, sleeping under awnings, the constant hunger, and the disdainful looks he received daily. He listened. Cristiano Ronaldo remained attentive, not interrupting. The empathy in his eyes was evident, and at certain moments he even furrowed his brow, angered by everything Pedro had been through. "And you never thought about seeking help? A shelter, maybe?" Ronaldo asked after a moment of silence. Pedro gave a small, sad smile. "I tried, but it's not always easy. Many places are full or don't take in kids alone, and some people just pretend we don't exist." Ronaldo nodded slowly. He knew this was the reality for many children around the world. "And do you like soccer?" he asked, shifting the tone of the conversation slightly. Pedro's eyes lit up. "I love soccer. Whenever I see a group playing in the street, I try to join. But most of the time, they don't let me. They say I'm dirty, that I might ruin the ball town." Cristiano Ronaldo sighed and shook his head, disapproving of those cruel words. "You know, Pedro," he began, "I also come from a humble family. I grew up without many resources, but my passion for soccer helped me keep going. I had opportunities that brought me to where I am today." The boy listened intently, absorbing every word. "And I think it's time someone gave you an opportunity too," Ronaldo continued with a smile. Pedro frowned, not quite understanding. What do you mean?" Cristiano Ronaldo leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. "I want to help you, Pedro, not just with a meal tonight, but with something that can change your life forever." Pedro felt his heart race. Was this a dream? Was someone finally offering him a real chance? Not knowing exactly what was coming, but feeling a hope he hadn't felt in a long time, Pedro looked at Ronaldo with a mix of emotion and anticipation. He had no idea that in that moment his life was about to take a turn he could never have imagined. Pedro looked at Cristiano Ronaldo, unable to believe what he was hearing. Throughout his life on the streets, he had learned that no one cared about him. People hurried past, pretended not to see him, looked away when he reached out his hand. But now, sitting across from one of the greatest soccer players in the world, he felt something different. Hope. "Help me." "How?" Pedro asked, his voice trembling, still fearing it was too good to be true. Cristiano Ronaldo smiled reassuringly. "First, we'll make sure you have a place to sleep tonight," he said. "I'm not letting you go back to the streets. I'll pay for a hotel for you, and tomorrow we'll start sorting out your situation." Pedro's eyes widened. He could hardly believe it. A real bed, a hot shower, food he didn't have to beg for. It seemed like a dream too distant to be real. Ronaldo called one of his assistants, who was in the restaurant, and gave instructions. Within minutes, a room at a good hotel in the city was reserved for Pedro. But the player didn't stop there. "And then?" Pedro asked, still unsure what this meant for his future. "Then we'll think long-term," Ronaldo replied. "I'll contact an organization that helps street children. They'll provide you with support, education, and a safe environment to grow up in." Pedro felt a lump in his throat. Since losing his parents, no one had talked about his future. No one had cared about what would happen to him. But now someone not only saw him, but also believed in him. Cristiano Ronaldo stood up from the table and placed a firm hand on Pedro's shoulder. "Let's go, kid. Your new life starts today." Pedro swallowed hard and followed Ronaldo out of the restaurant. He felt the eyes on him, but this time they weren't filled with disdain. They were filled with admiration, curiosity. He was no longer the invisible boy everyone ignored. That night, as he lay in the hotel bed, feeling the comfort of soft sheets and the warmth of a safe environment, Pedro closed his eyes and smiled for the first time in a long time. He still didn't know exactly what the future held, but he was certain of one thing: his life would never be the same, and destiny had an even bigger surprise in store for him. In the days that followed, Pedro's life began to change in ways he could never have imagined. Early the next morning, after his first night in a real hotel room, he was taken by one of Cristiano Ronaldo's assistants to a support center for street children. The place was run by a reputable organization that provided shelter, food, education, and, to his surprise, sports activities. Pedro could hardly believe it. After years of wandering the streets, sleeping rough and facing hunger and humiliation, he now had a roof over his head, daily meals, and the chance to study. But the biggest surprise was yet to come. A few days later, Cristiano Ronaldo made a special visit to the center. He greeted the children, took photos, and spoke with the staff running the program. But above all, he wanted to know how Pedro was adjusting. "How have these days been, kid?" he asked, sitting next to him on one of the benches by the soccer field at the center. Pedro smiled, still shy, but his eyes sparkled with happiness. "Better than I could have imagined," he replied. "I didn't know life could be like this, so good." Cristiano Ronaldo smiled and ruffled the boy's hair. "I'm glad to hear that. But tell me, do you still want to play soccer?" Pedro's eyes widened. "More than anything," he exclaimed excitedly. "Great," Ronaldo said, pleased with the answer. "I've talked to some friends and arranged something special for you." Pedro frowned, confused. "What?" Cristiano Ronaldo pulled an envelope from his pocket and handed it to the boy. With trembling hands, Pedro opened it and saw an official document. It was an admission letter to one of the best soccer academies in the city, fully paid for. This is for me?" he asked, unable to believe it. "Yes," Ronaldo confirmed. "Here you'll not only get professional training, but also education and all the opportunities to build a future. But remember, talent is important, but effort and discipline are everything. Are you ready for this journey?" Pedro felt a lump in his throat and his eyes filled with tears. He couldn't speak, just nodded his head repeatedly. Cristiano Ronaldo smiled and gave the boy a light pat on the shoulder. "Then it's settled. From now on, you have a new path ahead." That night, Pedro couldn't sleep. He thought about all the hardships he had endured, all the times he had felt hunger and despair. But now he had a new chance. He was no longer just a street kid. Now he had a purpose, a dream, and above all, someone who believed in him. And little did he know that in the future, his journey would inspire millions of people around the world. Months passed, and Pedro's life took a completely different turn. He dedicated himself fully to his training at the soccer academy, making the most of every opportunity that came his way. At first he felt insecure, surrounded by boys who already had experience with professional coaches and fields. But Pedro had something no one could take away from him, the grit of someone who knew the pain of survival. In the early days of training, he pushed himself harder than anyone else. He ran beyond his limits, practiced even after the others had left, and listened carefully to every piece of advice from the coaches. His natural talent began to shine, and in no time, he became one of the most promising players at the academy. Cristiano Ronaldo kept a close eye on his progress. Whenever he could, he sent messages of encouragement and, on a few occasions, showed up to watch the training sessions. Pedro didn't want to disappoint him. He knew he wasn't just playing soccer, he was proving he deserved this chance. Time went by, and the little boy who had once been humiliated in a restaurant became a standout young athlete. His story gained attention, inspiring many people. TV programs began to talk about him, and journalists wanted to know more about the street kid who had been helped by one of the greatest soccer players in the world. One day, after a decisive match in a youth tournament, Pedro was called for a live interview. Still catching his breath from the game, his uniform stained with grass and sweat, he took the microphone and looked into the camera. "If someone had told me a year ago that I'd be here today, I wouldn't have believed it," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "But everything changed because someone believed in me, because someone gave me a chance when no one else cared." He paused, took a deep breath and continued. "And I want to give back. I want other kids living on the streets to have the same opportunity I had." The audience rose to their feet, applauding. Cristiano Ronaldo, who was watching everything from afar, smiled with pride. He knew he had done the right thing. And now Pedro was not just a boy he had helped, he was an inspiration to the world. The homeless boy, humiliated in a restaurant, had found his way, and his story was just beginning. Don't forget to subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and leave your like so more people can discover stories that change lives.